In the early days of Middle-earth, long before he became the dreaded Witch King of Angmar, there was a man of great renown, a ruler whose legacy, though ultimately tragic, began in glory. He was one of the 9 kings of men, a lord whose wisdom, power, and wealth were admired throughout his realm. His early life remains cloaked in mystery, much like many of the greatest figures of ancient times. But what is known paints a picture of a ruler who stood out even among the mighty kings of Middle-earth. It is likely that he was one of the Númenórean-descended men, those blessed with long life and wisdom far surpassing that of other men. The Númenóreans, with their bloodline linked to the ancient noble Eldar, were a people revered for their deep understanding of the world, their strength in battle, and their capacity for leadership. Their kingdoms were vast and prosperous, and they commanded respect from all corners of the earth. Among these legendary rulers, this man's kingdom flourished. His domain was rich and vibrant, a beacon of prosperity amidst the chaos that often reigned in other regions of Middle-earth. His people adored him, seeing in their king not only a mighty ruler, but a protector, a guide, and a figure of justice who wielded power with a careful hand. In his courts there was talk of his wisdom and fairness, for he had brought stability and strength to a land that was fraught with danger from within and without. Yet, even in times of peace, the shadow of ambition loomed over him. This ruler was not content to sit on his throne and watch over his kingdom. Though beloved by his people and respected by his allies, there was always a restlessness within him, a need to secure not just the present, but the future, not just for his people, but for himself. Despite the greatness of his kingdom, despite the adoration of his subjects, the ruler felt a growing sense of unease as the years went by. His kingdom, though prosperous, was but a fragment of the vast world, a small piece of the larger puzzle that was Middle-earth. And though he ruled with wisdom and strength, he knew deep within that time was his enemy. For all his might, for all the power he wielded, he could not escape the looming specter of mortality that haunted even the greatest of men. As he grew older, the realization of his own mortality began to weigh heavily upon him. The line of Númenóreans was known for their longevity, and indeed he lived far longer than most men of Middle-earth. But the fear of death, the knowledge that even his great life would one day come to an end, gnawed at him like a festering wound. No matter how many years he might have left, no matter how grand his reign, the end was inevitable. And this thought filled him with dread. The Númenórean kings of old had seen their glory fade, and this too haunted him. Though he lived in a time when men still held sway over vast lands, he could see the cracks forming in the foundations of the great kingdoms. Internal strife, jealousy, ambition, and external threats from dark forces. These all contributed to the slow but steady decline of the great civilizations of men. As he observed the world around him, his fear of death was compounded by a fear of fading into obscurity, of his kingdom one day falling as others had before him. He sought not just to live, but to live forever in the memory of the world. He craved a legacy that would endure beyond the fleeting years of his mortal existence. It was during this period of inner turmoil, when his fears and ambitions were at their peak, that he caught the attention of Sauron, the Dark Lord, who was then quietly moving his pieces across the board of Middle-earth. At this time, Sauron had not yet revealed his true form. Instead, he walked among the rulers of men, elves, and dwarves under the guise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, a figure of great wisdom and benevolence, or so he seemed. Sauron was no fool. He knew that the greatest among the rulers of Middle-earth were often the most vulnerable to temptation, for they held more to lose, and their ambitions could be twisted to serve his own ends. Sauron's plan was subtle but far-reaching. He sought out the mightiest of kings, those who could influence the course of history. He approached them not with threats, but with gifts, with promises that seemed too good to be true. For the rulers of men, Sauron offered something irresistible: rings of power, rings that would grant the wearers extraordinary abilities, and more importantly, extend their lives far beyond the span of even the longest-lived Númenóreans. These rings, forged in secret by Sauron himself, were imbued with power, but that power came with a hidden price. When Sauron came to the king who would one day become the Witch King, he found a man who was ripe for manipulation. Here was a ruler who feared death above all things, who desired to preserve his kingdom and his legacy for all time. The offer of a ring that promised immortality and unthinkable power was more than the king could resist. Sauron did not present the ring as a chain or a tool of enslavement. He spoke of it as a gift of wisdom and might, something that would allow the king to secure peace and prosperity for his people for generations. The king, blind to the true nature of the offer, accepted the ring without hesitation, eager to ensure that his name would live on forever. What the king did not realize was that this ring, like all the rings of power, was a tool for Sauron's domination. The rings were tied to the one ring, which Sauron had forged in the fires of Mount Doom to control the others. By accepting the ring, the king had unknowingly bound himself to Sauron's will. The true purpose of the ring was not to grant immortality or wisdom, but to enslave the wearer's spirit, to bring him under the sway of the Dark Lord. At first, the king noticed none of this. The ring granted him what he had desired: extended life and power beyond that of any mortal man. His kingdom continued to prosper, and he ruled with strength for many years, long after he should have succumbed to age. But the ring's power was insidious. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, it began to change him. His thoughts became darker, his ambitions more ruthless. His desire for power, once tempered by a sense of justice, grew unchecked. He became cold and distant, more focused on maintaining his rule than on the well-being of his people. The whispers among his subjects began soon after. They spoke of their king's strange new demeanor, of how he no longer seemed like the man they had once known. He grew more reclusive, less interested in the daily affairs of his kingdom, and more obsessed with the idea of power and immortality. He wore the ring constantly, believing it was the source of his strength, but in reality, it was slowly binding his soul to Sauron. The change was gradual, and at first the king was unaware of the extent of his transformation. But as the years passed, the effects of the ring became impossible to ignore. His body, once strong and vital, began to fade. He no longer aged as men do, but neither did he live as they did. His physical form slowly withered, losing substance, becoming a mere shadow of what it once was. He could still be seen, but he was no longer truly part of the world of the living. His spirit, once free, was now bound to the ring and to Sauron. The more he used the ring, the more his will was bent to that of the Dark Lord. He found himself thinking not of his own desires, but of Sauron's. His thoughts turned darker and more twisted, and his once noble ambition was replaced by a desire to serve the Dark Lord's will. Though his kingdom still stood, it was no longer a place of light and prosperity. A shadow had fallen over the land, and the people, once loyal and proud, began to fear their king. As his physical form faded, the king was drawn into the world of shadows. He became a wraith, a being caught between life and death. His humanity drained away, leaving only a twisted shell of the man he once was. His body, once mortal, was now ethereal, able to move between the seen and unseen worlds. He was no longer a man, but something far darker, something bound to Sauron's will. His transformation into the Witch King had begun. The process was agonizing. His physical body decayed, but his mind remained intact, fully aware of the horrors that were happening to him, but powerless to stop it. The ring extended his life far beyond its natural span. But this was no gift. It was a twisted, perverse form of immortality. He could no longer feel joy or warmth, only the cold embrace of the shadow that now consumed him. The longer he bore the ring, the more he lost of himself. His name, his identity, his very soul were slowly being erased. By the time the transformation was complete, he was no longer the wise and noble king he had once been. He had become the Witch King, the leader of the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, who served Sauron without question. His kingdom had fallen into ruin, his people had scattered, and the legacy he had so desperately sought to preserve was lost. He was now a servant of darkness, a tool of Sauron's will, with no memory of the man he had once been. The Witch King of Angmar was born, and with him, a reign of terror that would last for centuries. As the Witch King's transformation into a wraith neared completion, Sauron, recognizing the growing power and malleability of his most prominent servant, appointed him as the Lord of Angmar, a desolate and remote region in the northern reaches of Middle-earth. It was in this icy and forbidding land that the Witch King would establish his dark kingdom and begin a campaign of terror and destruction that would reshape the political and geographical landscape of the north. Angmar itself was a cold and barren place, far removed from the lush lands of the south. Its jagged mountains and snow-covered plains were inhospitable to all but the hardiest of creatures. But it was also a place of strategic importance. Located far from the watchful eyes of Gondor and the elves of Rivendell, it offered a perfect base from which Sauron's forces could operate in secret. It was here that the Witch King began to gather his army, a dark and twisted host composed of orcs, trolls, wolves, and other foul creatures of the night. Under his command, Angmar quickly transformed from a desolate wasteland into a bastion of darkness, teeming with the forces of evil. The Witch King, now fully immersed in the power granted by his ring and his connection to Sauron, began to wage a relentless war against the northern kingdoms of men. Chief among his enemies were the Dunedain, the descendants of Numenor, whose kingdom of Arnor had long been a bastion of resistance against the encroaching darkness. But Arnor was no longer the unified and powerful realm it had once been. Internal strife had fractured the kingdom into three smaller realms: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar. This division, coupled with years of political instability, made Arnor an easy target for the Witch King's wrath. The Witch King was a master of manipulation and fear, and he knew that brute force alone would not be enough to conquer the north. Instead, he employed cunning and deceit to weaken his enemies from within before delivering the final blow. His first target was the kingdom of Rudar, a land already steeped in treachery and discontent. For years, the rulers of Rudar had vied for power among themselves, neglecting their people and their defenses. The Witch King saw an opportunity in this fractured realm and moved swiftly to exploit it. Through a combination of diplomacy, threats, and dark magic, the Witch King managed to place a puppet ruler on the throne of Rudar, a man who was easily swayed by the promises of power and wealth offered by the Witch King. With Rudar under his control, the Witch King now had a foothold from which to launch his campaign against the remaining northern kingdoms. The people of Rudar, already disillusioned with their leaders, were powerless to resist the Witch King's growing influence, and soon the land fell into darkness, its once proud inhabitants reduced to slaves under the yoke of Angmar. With Rudar in his grasp, the Witch King turned his attention to Cardolan, another of the fractured realms of Arnor. Cardolan, though more stable than Rudar, was still vulnerable to the Witch King's dark sorcery and relentless military might. The people of Cardolan, aware of the growing threat from Angmar, attempted to mount a defense, but they were no match for the forces the Witch King commanded. His armies swept through Cardolan like a storm, laying waste to its towns and villages, and the once vibrant land was soon reduced to a barren wasteland. The royal line of Cardolan was extinguished, and its people scattered, unable to withstand the overwhelming darkness that had descended upon them. The fall of Cardolan left only one remaining stronghold in the north, Arthedain, the last remnant of the once great kingdom of Arnor. Arthedain was ruled by the descendants of Isildur, and its kings had long been vigilant against the encroaching darkness. They knew that their kingdom was all that stood between Angmar and the complete domination of the north. For years, the kings of Arthedain had fortified their defenses, prepared for the day when the Witch King would turn his gaze upon them. That day came soon enough, and it marked the beginning of a long and brutal war between Angmar and Arthedain. The Witch King, having already crushed Rudor and Cardolan, now directed the full force of his armies against Arthedain. His attacks were relentless, his tactics brutal. He used fear as a weapon, knowing that his very presence on the battlefield could send his enemies into disarray. His mastery of dark sorcery gave him an edge that no mortal army could hope to match. Entire garrisons of Arthedain's soldiers would flee at the mere sight of the Witch King's forces approaching on the horizon, and those who stayed to fight often found themselves paralyzed with terror. Despite their best efforts, the forces of Arthedain were slowly worn down by the Witch King's relentless assault. Over the course of many years, the Witch King launched devastating raids and sieges against Arthedain's fortresses and cities, systematically dismantling the kingdom piece by piece. The capital city of Fornost, once a proud symbol of resistance, became the last bastion of hope for the people of Arthedain. But even Fornost, with its mighty walls and valiant defenders, could not hold out forever. The final siege of Fornost was one of the most significant events in the history of the northern kingdoms. The Witch King, having gathered his full strength, launched an overwhelming attack on the city. His forces, bolstered by dark sorcery and brute strength, laid waste to Fornost's defenses, and the city's walls, though strong, eventually fell. The last king of Arthedain, Arvedui, was forced to flee into the frozen wastes of the north, where he met his tragic end, lost to the icy wilderness. With the fall of Fornost, the kingdom of Arnor was effectively destroyed, and the Witch King had succeeded in eradicating the last of the northern Dunedain. The Witch King's triumph in the north was complete, but it was a hollow victory. Though he had shattered the northern kingdoms and crushed his enemies, there was no personal satisfaction in his conquests. His identity, his ambitions, and his desires had long since been subsumed by Sauron's will. He no longer sought personal glory or power. He existed only to serve his master. The destruction of Arnor, which had once been a proud goal for the Witch King, now seemed meaningless in the grander scheme of Sauron's dark plans. Though victorious, the Witch King's reign in Angmar was not destined to last. The survivors of Arnor, led by the remaining Dunedain, waged a long and bitter guerrilla war against the forces of Angmar, refusing to surrender to the darkness that had overtaken their homeland. More importantly, the southern kingdom of Gondor, the sister realm to Arnor, recognized the growing threat posed by the Witch King and his expanding power in the north. Though distant, Gondor understood that the fall of Arnor was not just a regional catastrophe, but a part of a larger plan by Sauron to extend his dominion over Middle-earth. The king of Gondor, Ernur, gathered a great army and marched north to confront the Witch King. This culminated in the climactic Battle of Fornost, a confrontation that would decide the fate of the northern lands. The Witch King, confident in his power and bolstered by the dark magic of the ring, led his forces into battle against Gondor and the remaining Dunedain. The armies clashed in a fierce and bloody conflict, with the Witch King's forces initially gaining the upper hand. But the combined strength of Gondor and the northern Dunedain proved too much, even for the Witch King. In the final moments of the battle, Ernur faced the Witch King in single combat. Though Erna was a skilled and valiant warrior, the Witch King's power was overwhelming. Yet, in a surprising turn of events, the Witch King did not slay Erna. Instead, sensing that his time in the north was drawing to a close, the Witch King chose to retreat, abandoning his stronghold in Angmar. His departure was not one of defeat, but a tactical withdrawal, for Sauron had summoned him back to Mordor to prepare for the next phase of the Dark Lord's grand plan. With the fall of Angmar, the northern kingdoms were left in ruins, but the damage inflicted by the Witch King's long campaign would leave lasting scars. The Dunedain were scattered, their kingdoms shattered, and though they continued to resist in small, hidden pockets, the northern lands would never fully recover from the devastation. The Witch King's time in Angmar had come to an end, but his legacy of terror and destruction would live on in the memories of those who had suffered under his reign. After his retreat from Angmar, the Witch King returned to Mordor, where he took up his role as Sauron's most trusted and powerful lieutenant. Over the centuries that followed, the Witch King helped rebuild Sauron's strength in secret, patiently waiting for the day when his master would rise once more to challenge the free peoples of Middle-earth. The Witch King had become the leader of the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, whose very presence brought terror and despair to all who opposed Sauron. His power had grown to such an extent that he was now the most feared servant of the Dark Lord, second only to Sauron himself. By the time of the War of the Ring, the Witch King was ready to carry out Sauron's final conquest, the destruction of Gondor, the last great kingdom of men, and the capture of the One Ring, which would restore Sauron to his full power. The Witch King's first significant task during this war was to lead the hunt for the One Ring. Sauron had learned that the ring had resurfaced and was in the hands of a hobbit from the Shire. The Witch King, along with the other Nazgul, was sent to track down the ring-bearer and retrieve the ring for Sauron. The hunt for the One Ring was relentless, and the Witch King's pursuit of Frodo Baggins and his companions became one of the most harrowing episodes of the war. Acting as the chief of the Nazgul, the Witch King led the search with terrifying precision. His mere presence drove fear into the hearts of Frodo and his companions, who knew that the Nazgul were relentless in their pursuit. The Witch King's power had grown to the point where even the bravest of men and elves quailed in his presence. One of the most pivotal moments in this hunt occurred at Weathertop, where the Witch King confronted Frodo and the others. During this encounter, the Witch King struck Frodo with a Morgul blade, a cursed weapon that inflicted a wound not just of the body, but of the spirit. The blade's dark magic was intended to slowly turn Frodo into a wraith, just as the 9 kings of men had been turned by their rings. This act demonstrated the Witch King's mastery of dark sorcery and his ability to inflict suffering that transcended mere physical harm. Though Frodo was eventually healed in Rivendell, the wound left by the Witch King would haunt him for the rest of his life, a testament to the enduring power of the Nazgul. Despite this setback, the Witch King's campaign of terror continued. His next major task was the siege of Gondor, where Sauron's armies marched to destroy the last great bastion of men in Middle-earth. As the commander of Sauron's forces, the Witch King led a massive army of orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures to the gates of Minas Tirith, the capital of Gondor. The siege of Minas Tirith was one of the most pivotal battles of the War of the Ring, and the Witch King played a central role in orchestrating the assault. During the siege, the Witch King once again demonstrated the full extent of his powers. Riding his fellbeast, a massive and terrifying creature of darkness, he led the charge against the city's defenses. His presence alone was enough to cause despair among the defenders of Gondor, and the men of Gondor, though valiant, found themselves overwhelmed by fear as the Witch King approached. With his dark magic, the Witch King shattered the great gates of Minas Tirith, a feat that no ordinary force of arms could accomplish. As the gates lay in ruins, the Witch King rode into the city, seemingly unstoppable. However, his overconfidence would soon lead to his undoing. As he advanced deeper into the city, he encountered Gandalf the White, the wise wizard who had long been a thorn in Sauron's side. Though the Witch King was a being of immense power, Gandalf was able to hold him at bay, preventing him from advancing further into the city. This confrontation marked a turning point in the siege, as the forces of Gondor, though battered, began to rally. Even more importantly, the arrival of Rohan's army, led by King Theoden, provided a crucial reinforcement that disrupted the Witch King's plans to quickly overrun the city. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, which took place outside the walls of Minas Tirith, was the culmination of the Witch King's campaign against Gondor. Here, the Witch King faced his ultimate fate. As the Rohirrim charged into battle, the Witch King took to the field on his fellbeast, determined to slay King Theoden and break the spirit of the Rohirrim. His attack on Theoden was devastating, and the Witch King's sheer power, both physical and magical, overwhelmed the king. Theoden was struck down, and it seemed for a moment that the Witch King would once again be victorious, and that the forces of darkness would triumph. But in this moment of apparent victory, the Witch King met his doom. A lone figure, Éowyn, the niece of King Theoden, stepped forward to challenge him. Disguised as a man to fight alongside her people, Éowyn stood defiant before the Witch King, despite the overwhelming terror that emanated from him. The Witch King, arrogant and assured of his invincibility, mocked her, believing that no man could kill him. This was his fatal miscalculation. Éowyn, a woman, was not bound by the prophecy that no living man could kill the Witch King. With the aid of Merry, a hobbit who struck a decisive blow from behind, Éowyn plunged her sword into the Witch King, piercing the shadowy form beneath his black armor. In that moment, the Witch King's physical form was destroyed, and his spirit was finally vanquished. The prophecy had come true, not by the hand of a man, but by the courage and resolve of a woman and a hobbit, two individuals whom the Witch King had dismissed as weak and insignificant. The death of the Witch King was a profound moment in the War of the Ring. It marked the end of Sauron's most powerful servant and a turning point in the battle. The tragedy of the Witch King's demise lay not only in his defeat, but in the hollow existence he had endured for so many centuries. Once a great king of men, he had been reduced to a wraith, serving the will of Sauron, devoid of any personal agency or ambition. His entire existence had been consumed by darkness, and his final defeat was not merely the loss of a battle, but the end of a soul that had been twisted beyond recognition. The man he once was had long been lost to history, and even in death, he was not remembered as a king or a ruler, but as the Witch King, a figure of fear and hatred. His fall also reflected the larger tragedy of the Rings of Power themselves. The 9 rings, which had once promised immortality and greatness, had instead brought ruin to the men who accepted them. The Witch King's story was the most extreme example of this ruin, as he had become the most powerful and feared of the Nazgul, but at the cost of everything that had once made him human. His identity, his will, and his soul had all been consumed by Sauron, and in the end, he died not as the man he once was, but as a shadow in service to a greater darkness. The legacy of the Witch King endures in Middle-earth's history as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting power of evil. His downfall, while bringing hope to the free peoples of Middle-earth, is a reminder of the fragility of the human spirit when faced with temptation. The Witch King's death, though a victory for the forces of good, is ultimately a tragic conclusion to the life of a once great king who lost everything, his kingdom, his identity, and his very soul, to the darkness of Sauron.